I did. And I kept on going, and I found all kinds of little things like this which worked out beautifully. So I started to think, this is a very good way to understand the world. Even though the text is difficult at first. So I wanted to then take on the intellectual project of asking the question, is it possible to understand housing issues, urbanization issues in general, by using Marx? And in order to answer that question, I had to understand Marx. So that led me into eventually writing The Limits to Capital, which is not a book about contemporary capitalism. It's a book about Marx's theory of capital. I think that's very important to understand. And so I sought to reconstruct it. But in reconstructing that theory, I had to go beyond what was in Volume 1. I had to get deeply into Volume 2, which is about fixed capital formation and the turnover time of fixed capital. How long does it take for capital to come back out of housing investment? What are the consequences, and how can fixed capital be financed? Well, you need a credit system. So I had to go to Volume 3 to look at how Marx understood the credit system and the financial system. And most presentations on Marx did not deal with those questions. Above all, I had to go to the theory of rent and land value and property values. And most presentations on Marx ignored those questions. So what Limits to Capital did was to try to give an overview of all of Marx's theory, not only Volume 1, but Volume 2 and Volume 3, and also other economic texts like the 3 volumes of Theories of Surplus Value. And from that overview, to bring Marx's theory to a point where it could deal with questions of housing, investment, city building, rent extractions, financial games which get played by interest-bearing capital as it circulates in city construction and city environments. But I was not primarily interested in Marx. I was always primarily interested in urbanization, but I wanted a theory of urbanization that could work. And I felt this laid the foundation for that. And it has therefore laid the foundation for everything I've written ever since about urbanization. That this is, if you like, the basic framework I would use to look at urban processes under capitalism, what they look like and why they are. And to the degree that urbanization has not gone away, this framework is therefore useful and continues to be useful precisely because it takes up all of those other elements in Marx's theory that are often ignored, Volume 2 of Capital in particular, and much of Volume 3, which is ignored. But there's a second reason why this text is actually useful today. Marx's theory is not a theory of an actually existing capitalism. It's a theory of capital, of how capital works. And Marx's theory of how capital works is not based upon empirical or historical inquiry. It is based on the writings of the classical political economists. In effect, what Marx does is to read all of the political economists, some 200 of them, very carefully. Adam Smith, of course, Malthus, Ricardo, James Stewart, whole group of other figures going back into the 17th century. Marx read all of them very, very carefully. And he made the judgment that, for the most part, these were serious people who were trying to understand the nature of the society that was emerging around them. And that their writings could therefore form the raw material for an understanding of how capital worked. But he had to approach that raw material in a critical way. So Marx set out very early on to apply a critical method to classical political economy, to ask the question, what is it the classical political economists are seeing? What is it the classical political economists are missing? What is it that they don't see? And why do they have blinders and blinkers on that mean that they cannot see certain essential characteristics of the system? Marx engaged in a practice which we now call, thanks to Jacques Derrida, deconstruction. And he was looking for what we now call the aporias, the lacunae, the empty boxes, the bits left out that are secretly there in these texts. Now, I'm not a great admirer of Derrida, because when people say, oh, you can learn deconstruction from Derrida, I say I learned deconstruction by reading Marx's critique of the political economists. And it's beautifully, beautifully done. Now, but the classical political economists also had a project. Much of their thinking was infused with a utopian vision. And their utopian vision was that it would be possible to construct a market society which, when perfected, would work to the benefit of all. This was Adam Smith's main claim, that a perfect market operating under perfected conditions would construct a hidden hand that would moderate and construct everybody's activities in such a way as to redound to the benefit of everybody. Adam Smith was giving advice to statesmen, and was saying to statesmen, if you want your country to be wealthy, the best thing you can do is liberate your market. If you want your country to be wealthy, the best thing you can do is to involve yourself in free trade. This is what Adam Smith was saying. So what Marx does is to accept that utopian vision and say, all right, let us assume I'm dealing with a society which is based on a perfect market. That is chapter 2 of volume 1 of Capital. The structure of a perfect market. And throughout Capital, Marx always assumes that the market is operating in a perfect way. Well, we know markets don't work perfectly. And Marx was not stupid enough to think that markets were operating perfectly. What he wanted to do was to say the utopian vision of the classical political economists about capital is fatally flawed. I am going to show that the closer you get to a perfect market, the greater will be the wealth of the capitalist class and the greater will be the impoverishment of the working class. In other words, the perfected market will not act in such a way as to be to the benefit of all. A perfected market will simply benefit capital, not labor. And what Capital Volume 1 does is to show you step by step why that must be so. It is a brilliantly argued dialectical unfolding so that by the time you get to chapter 25 of Volume 1, Marx can say, if this kind of society is constructed in the way that Adam Smith and Ricardo and everybody else was seeking, if it was made that way, then the result would be an embarrassment of riches for the capitalist class and impoverishment, degradation for the working class. Now, is capitalist society constructed in such a way as to operate with perfected markets? In the 1960s, it was not. There was a great deal of state intervention in the markets. In some cases, of course, in Europe, you had nationalized industries. In some cases, you had a great deal of state planning. You had a great deal of redistribution of wealth and income going on, so that the social wage of the working class was engineered through the state apparatus. So if you're in a European country, you'd find yourself living under a social democracy in which monies were being taxed away from the wealthy and put to education, put to health care. So actually, in 1970, we were not living in a society that in any way related to a perfect market economy. But then in the 1970s, something interesting happened. A campaign was launched to say, this society which we live in is inefficient. It is not working. It is badly constructed. It is slow growth. Trade unions are too powerful. All of this redistribution of wealth is making people lazy. People are not thinking about how they should work. They're thinking about how they can just live without doing anything. And so suddenly we get, in the 1970s, the neoliberal project. And the neoliberal project has been to get the state out of the market, or at least get the state out of that part of the market which is actually redistributing wealth from the upper classes to the lower classes. So suddenly, neoliberalism comes along, and we get Reagan and we get Thatcher. We get the military governments here and right throughout Latin America, Pinochet, everybody taking this line. Kohl in Germany. They took it at different speeds and different places, different mechanisms. But essentially, the slogan from the mid-1970s onwards was, let the free market rule. If there's a problem, let the free market do it. In other words, it was a reinstallation of the utopian project of the classical political economists. And what did Marx say would happen if you did that? He said you'd end up with enormous wealth at one pole and enormous impoverishment at the other pole. What has happened? Look at the income data distributions in 1970 in almost any major capitalist country. Look at them now. Look at them globally. And you will see that Marx was right. When you went to a society which is founded on free market and free trade, there was a redistribution of wealth. And that redistribution of wealth is from the poor to the rich, not from the rich to the poor. Is that still going on? In 2012, Oxfam, the charity, estimates that the top 100 billionaires in the world, that includes people in Brazil, Mexico, Russia, China, India, Indonesia, the top 100 billionaires in the world increased their wealth by $240 billion in 1 year. 2012. In 2012, the mass of the population in the industrialized countries were getting poorer by a very considerable margin. They were losing on wages. They were losing on the social wage because everything from municipal services was being degraded in the name of austerity. So here you have a situation where actually right now, precisely because we've had 30 or 40 years of trying to get back to what it was that the classical political economists wanted, precisely for that reason, Marx is more relevant now than he's ever been. And he's more relevant precisely because the dynamics of capital have moved us back to that 19th